Okay, well, thank you all for coming. I look around and it's a surprisingly crowded room. My name is Toby Dodge, and I'm the director of the Middle East Centre here at LSE. So I'd like to welcome you to LSE in the Middle East Centre. Ever since Mandy Turner described her project to me, I was very keen to bring her and a selection of the researchers that she's brought together for this project to LSE to bring the nascent research findings to a much wider audience in London. So I'm very, very glad we could manage to do that, and Mandy's brought that together. I think we're working towards a book that will be published over the next 12 months, and for you, of course, more importantly, a policy document published by the Middle East Centre at LSE as well. So we welcome that, and I'd just like to say the LSE Middle East Centre is very proud to present a platform to a diversity of voices on the whole of the Middle East, including both Israel and Palestine. We know very much that these discussions can invoke passion, justifiably deeply held views and opinions. But within these four walls and within a university, we all collectively expect that those passions and views are expressed within the common civility of academic and intellectual debate, and I'm sure, looking at everyone here, they will do. So without further ado, I hand over to my colleague Ala to take control of events.
Thank you very much, Toby, and good afternoon. And once again, thank you all for being here today in yet another event by the LSE Middle East Centre. And please check the website and join the mailing list of the Middle East Centre. There are plenty of events this term, and they will be really exciting, and you will enjoy all the wealth of knowledge that will be presented there. My name is Ala Tartir, and I'm the Program Director of Al-Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network. I finished my PhD International Development Studies earlier this year from here, LSE, and tomorrow I'm starting my postdoctorate journey at the Graduate Institute in Geneva. We have great speakers here. They spent so many years in their lives studying aspects of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And today we will have two panels. Each panel will last strictly for 1 hour 45 minutes. We will have 30 minutes a coffee break between both panels, and I will introduce each speaker before he or she presents the paper. Each presentation will be only for 20 minutes, and we will have from 30 to 35 minutes for Q&A session. In this first panel, we will start with a very brief introduction about the project, which is from the river to the sea, taking the pulse of Palestine-Israel 20 years after Oslo, by Dr. Mandy Turner next to me. Then Diana Bhutto will join us via Skype, hopefully, to tell us what happened to Oslo Accords. And then Mandy will join us again and tell us what is the story with the Western donors' aid to the occupied Palestinian territories over the last 20 years. And finally, in this panel, we will have Dr. Mansour Nasasra, who will tell us and talk about the Palestinians in Palestine who were left out of Oslo Accords. As Toby just said before, we will have the Q&A session, so please introduce yourself, ask the question please directly, and let it be short, and let's enjoy a very constructive discussion and debate. Mandy Turner, who is a visiting fellow here at the LSE Middle East Centre, she's also the director of the Kenyon Institute, the Council of British Research in the Levant in Jerusalem, will introduce the project now in about 7 to 10 minutes. Mandy, please.
Thanks, Ella. Is this working? Okay. So I'm just going to say a couple of words about the project, and I'll keep it short because poor Mansour has the very difficult task of synthesising two incredibly large pieces of research, so we've given him a little bit more time. Now this event is the culmination of 2 years of research which was funded by the British Academy and carried out by the Council for British Research in the Levant's East Jerusalem Research Centre called the Kenyon Institute. It was undertaken by a team of well-published experts based in Israel and Palestine. Most of them are here today. A couple of them are being Skyped in, and a couple of them couldn't come for personal and work commitments. As Toby already said, the research from this project will come out in two formats. There'll be a working paper published by the LSE Middle East Centre, which will come out, inshallah, at the beginning of next year, and an edited book possibly towards the end of next year. As we all know, the long, laborious process of publishing with academic publishers, and it's not a good one. So I want to start off by thanking the British Academy for their generous funding, and to the researchers involved in this project for their participation. It's been a real pleasure to work with all of them. I've learned a lot from all of them, and they're all people that are really at the top of their game in terms of the research that they've conducted. I'm also grateful to the LSE Middle East Centre for putting on this event today. They've been incredibly patient, including today with these final hiccups, and particularly Sandra, who's been incredibly wonderful towards me over the last couple of weeks. And thanks to Toby, who's been very enthusiastic about us presenting the findings here. The LSE is where I did all my studies, so it feels like a natural place to be presenting this first really big project on Palestine. So that's all the thank yous taken care of. In less than 2 weeks' time, it will be 22 years since the signing of the Oslo Peace Accord between Israel and the Palestine Liberation Organisation, and a lot has happened since then. Most of you are aware that the possibility of peace between Israel and the Palestinians is not looking good at the moment, and that's possibly putting it incredibly mildly. There's no political negotiations, the occupation continues, settlement expansion continues, Gaza is isolated and under blockade, and the geography and political framework of a potential Palestinian state is under intense pressure and is fragmenting every day. Furthermore, there seems to be an increasingly acrimonious debate about the feasibility and desirability of a two-state solution in this context, from both sides. And within that, there also seems to be a bit of a tacit acknowledgement that the two-state solution will either not be implemented or it will actually not work in practice. However, despite all these aspects, the Oslo Framework still persists. And this framework has been a hegemonic straitjacket that structures the current situation. It's created both the political legal reality for the peoples in question, as well as intellectually restricting how we understand the situation and possibly discuss and analyse potential solutions. Now, the Oslo Framework, which Diana's going to go into in more depth, hopefully, when you fix out the technical problems. The Oslo Framework was the practical outcome of the peace negotiations signed between Israel and the PLO, beginning with the Oslo Accord in 1993. And these agreements committed the parties to track one bilateral negotiations towards a resolution of the conflict, and this was to be overseen by the United States. It was to lead to the creation of a form of partial self-government for the Palestinian people, which came to be known as the Palestinian Authority. There was no discussion of a state at that point. There was an economic customs union, the Paris Protocol, which Raja Khalidi will talk about in the next session, and a phased withdrawal of Israeli occupation forces that justified the zoning of the occupied territories into areas A, B and C. And each of these areas had different modalities of governance and control. Now, over the last couple of years, there's been a number of studies of the failure of the Oslo Peace Framework, maybe perhaps too many. And in fact, a lot of us involved in this project have been involved in these other studies too. So we've been guilty of filling the internet and the bookshops with these studies. However, I'd like to kind of argue for the USP of this project. Most of these other projects started with analysing the feasibility of the two-state solution, and when I first talked to Dimi Ryder, who'll be joining us in session 2, Dimi was involved with a project with the Council for European Relations where that's exactly what they were asked to do, to look at the feasibility of the two-state solution. What we wanted to do is to open that bag a little bit and allow people the space to analyse actually what had actually happened on the ground, not just whether it fitted into the two-state model or not. So what we sought to do was to analyse the impact of 20 years of this Oslo Framework on the area from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, as well as what the agreements and negotiations, the economic protocols and the international donors achieved and what they did not achieve. So hence why we called the event here today From the River to the Sea. Because we actually tried to analyse the impact of this peace framework on the different communities. All of them were impacted by this framework, and how these communities themselves conceptualised this framework, how they reacted to it, and what possibly they conceive their future to be, either within this framework or out with it. So the communities we analysed were Palestinians inside the West Bank, particularly political strategies and economic strategies, Palestinians inside Gaza, Palestinians in East Jerusalem, Israel and Jewish Israeli society, and Palestinians inside Israel. Now we divided that up because Oslo impacted on Palestinians inside Israel, but in a different way to that of Jewish Israelis, and we thought it was important to unpack that experience. Now, we also did analyses of the involvement of the donor community because they had such a central role to play, as well as an analysis of the high diplomatic level of negotiations. Research has also been conducted on alternative ideas to the dominant Oslo two-state paradigm, which will be the last paper of the day by Shireen Hussain, my former deputy director. So the result of this research, we hope, is twofold. Firstly, we want to try and provide a rich assessment of the situation as it affects all the people who live in that space from the river to the sea. And secondly, to provide a basis by which we move forward from this current impasse. So I want to thank you all very much for coming here today, and I hope to echo Toby and Allah that we can engage in a fruitful and meaningful discussion as the day develops. And I'm really hoping now that we can hand over to Diana. No?
Not yet. Not yet.
Is it likely soon, or do you think we should go ahead with...
Shall we
We're
change the
trying.
order?
I think the problem is from her end. We're trying to figure out what the problem is.
Okay.
Do you want to start?
Okay.
So let's change the order of the papers, and Mandy will start now, telling us about the Western aid to the OPT, and then hopefully by that time, after 20 minutes from now, we'll be able to solve the problem. Please, Mandy.
Okay, thank you. So my part of the research focused on donor assistance to the occupied territories from the signing of the peace accords in 1993 until the present day. I've been researching this since 2006, which is quite a long time, and I think it's maybe time this might be my last thing that I write about this. I was going to say there's no need to go over the Oslo Peace Accords because Diana has already done this, but obviously she hasn't. But I'm going to assume that she's going to give us the bigger framework, because if I do that here, we'll never get to the donors. Now, there's a lot of literature and debate on the topic of donor aid and the OPT, and my good friend and colleague Ala Tartia has also written about that. And I review it, all this literature in the chapter for the book. But here, for reasons of time, I'm just going to focus on a couple of issues, and I won't go into the big debates, but maybe we can come back to them in the discussion. So instead, I'm going to concentrate on a couple of things. The first is a brief analysis of the long-term stated objectives of Western peace building in the OPT, what type of activities were undertaken, and the type of structures that were created by donors to direct this aid. I was going to show you some nice little graphs and stuff, but I think I'll leave them to continue with their IT stuff there. The second thing I want to really concentrate on mostly is the findings from interviews that I've conducted over the last 12 to 18 months with the major Western donors and international agencies in the OPT. And that's what I'm interested in is this impasse. What do they think they're doing? Where do they think they're going with us? So I want to try and concentrate much more on that latter part of the research. Now, the results of these interviews and this research led to the title for this paper and possibly the chapter, which is No Plan B because Plan A cannot fail. And basically, in a nutshell, my interviews with these donors show that the Oslo Framework, including all the strategies, the assumptions, and the practices that underpin it, are incredibly resilient amongst the donors, and there is actually little to suggest that this is going to change in the short term. Now, I'll finish up, we hope if I don't run out of time, with some comments on why I think this is symptomatic of the problems with the current paradigm, and possibly suggest a new framework, although I'm very cynical that the donors would accept this. So firstly, a little bit of background and history to donor involvement in the OPT. Now, the Oslo Framework was the practical outcome of the peace agreement signed between Israel and the PLO that Diana is going to speak about after me, hopefully. These agreements committed the parties to track one bilateral negotiations, as I said. Also the creation of the partial form of self-government, the Palestinian Authority, and the Economic Customs Union, and this phased withdrawal, which created this division in the OPT between areas A, B and C, which actually has a lot of implications for donor strategies and development in the West Bank specifically. Now, into this context and framework, around 40 donor countries and dozens of UN and other multilateral agencies provided aid for governance, for development and for humanitarian purposes. Now, as I say, there's a number of ways that we could analyse donor aid. We could look at the sectorial breakdown of activities, or we could analyse the changes between these, and actually whether aid has succeeded or failed in promoting development. But I'm not going to focus on these debates, and to be honest with you, I'm not actually that interested in them. I'm much more interested in understanding the political motivations behind the aid, the declared and the hidden ones. Because the normal underlying principles for development are not the driving force in the OPT. And this is acknowledged by most development experts and donors continually. So I'm actually interested in how these policies and practices play themselves out in reality when they interact with the policies and priorities of Israel and the Palestinian political elite. And it's this three-way interaction that creates a very strange political economy in the OPT. Now, I'm focusing specifically on Western donors today, although I will talk about other types of donors in the chapter, because they actually set the framework for aid intervention and they largely guide the process. Other donors have had quite another level of impact, particularly the Arab donors, in terms of support for the PA. But they don't set the framework, so really I'm trying to understand here how the Oslo Framework set the whole agenda for development. The stated objectives of the Western donors right from the beginning has been to underpin the Oslo peace process and framework, and that was only supposed to last for 5 years. The less frequently publicly stated aim of aid, but one that the donors will admit to, and you can see kind of buried in their policy documents and you can witness in their practices, is actually to ensure stability. And that's what I've argued in quite a few pieces recently, that this is the underlying principle, is stability. So to actually analyse why, if donor aid is succeeding or failing, to me misses the point. It depends what you think is success or failure. There's some form of stability, not a very good one for one side. However, it is stable at the moment compared to the rest of the region. So Western donors have actually committed a significant amount of resources to these activities in the OPT, state building, economic development, civil society support. And this is shown by the level of overseas development assistance. I had some nice graphs, but I'm not going to show you them. So I was going to show you there's actually distinction between the pledges and the disbursements as well. So while the donors are very generous by what they say that they're going to give, they don't often follow through. So this often leads to recurring and accumulating gaps in the Palestinian Authority's finances. However, if I'd been able to show you the graph, you'd have seen that the donors and the agencies have invested a huge amount of resources. They've paid for development projects, for infrastructure building. They've built Palestinian institutions, they've rebuilt them after they've been destroyed, and they've also promoted Palestinian civil society organisations. So while it is very difficult to get accurate figures for aid, but the IMF estimated that the Palestinian Authority alone had received more than $15 billion in the 20 years since its creation. So that's a lot of aid that's gone to create this quasi-state structure in preparation for some sort of final settlement. But obviously I think this figure itself is probably on the low side, because donor aid there wasn't really tracked consistently until the mid-2000s, and even then there's donors that don't really declare what they're giving in terms of aid. But from 1994 to 2000, aid averaged around $500 million a year, but this doubled during the roadmap period, which was from 2002 onwards. Again, I could have shown you a nice curve. And it's actually continued to increase, as you can see when you look at the graphs. If you go to the OECD DAC database, it's a very visible spike, especially when we get to the split between the West Bank and Gaza in 2007. Now, I think that tells us something very interesting about what the donors are doing there. And at crisis points, the donors continually step in. And senior officials frequently tell me and others that this is necessary to keep the PA alive, to keep the two-state solution in the realms of possibility. So the structures that were created by the donors, there was an extensive layer of oversight committees created by the donors. I was going to show you a little graph. This is becoming a constant theme. Now, these structures are fairly typical of donor behaviour in other development contexts, particularly in conflict development contexts. Because I've worked on Kosovo and Bosnia before, so I was interested in how this differs, but it's actually fairly similar. But the Palestinian Authority is unique in that it's not got sovereignty, and the UN didn't take on sovereignty over for the Palestinian people like it did in Kosovo or in East Timor. So you had this situation where you had the most important players in the game who set the agenda were the UN, the World Bank, the EU and the US. I'm not going to go into how they operate because of time restrictions, but the way in which they do operate kind of reflect the relationships and roles of the main important actors in the region and the global structures of power. So the Americans set the diplomatic agenda, the EU provides most of the funding, the UN has multiple agencies operating there, and the World Bank largely sets the agenda and shapes the framework. Now, the West Bank and Gaza, which is the OECD DAC's label for the OPT, belongs to the group of lower middle income countries, and this is true in 93 and it remains true today. And so the problems that exist there aren't really the product of natural or human resources, but they're the outcome of the impacts of the occupation, Israel's policies and the Paris Protocol, which will be talked about in the next session. Now, the type of activities funded by the donors were actually structured and circumscribed by the geographical limitations and economic limitations of the Oslo Accord. And this created a necessity for this large and increasing amounts of aid. Now, if we look, this tended to be focused on Area A, where the PA has both governance and security control, and not areas B and C. This has meant that pockets of prosperity has been created, which writers have often referred to as bubbles. It's only in the last couple of years that the donors have recognised the problematic nature of this for the two-state solution, and they've now attempted to make some small development projects and help Palestinian communities in Area C. Now, what is really interesting is that donor policies tend to have been remarkably similar over the last 20 years. I thought that perhaps these things might have changed, that their adherence to the two-state solution and the Oslo Framework, that they might have started to consider a plan B, given that there was all these issues and stasis in the negotiations. But these interviews actually revealed a couple of interesting things. Firstly, that the level of commitment hasn't actually dropped, despite the financial problems in donor countries themselves, and despite the complete collapse of the peace process. Virtually all the donors say that the OPT remains a top priority area for them, and that they see this as the last roll of the dice, if you like, that they're committed to continuing with the resources needed to ensure the continuation of Oslo. Now, there has been some small changes, but generally most of these changes are related to trying to save this framework, despite the fact that nearly all of them tell me that they think it might be impossible to save it, that might be past saving. The small changes have been implemented in relation to more support for local municipalities and social work and humanitarian work. And this is like a kind of hedge in their bets. They'll continue to support the PA, but they'll also make sure that there's a backup if the PA collapses or disbands. Because there's a recognition that if it does, these things does happen, then the welfare of the population will really fall to the local government agencies, the NGOs, and the humanitarian agencies. Now, some of these senior aid officials spoke to me about trying to discuss a plan B, but that they said that there was deep opposition from their foreign ministries back home. And they said that at the Jerusalem-Ramallah level, what they'd concluded that what was likely that in the current circumstances, there would be merely an eroding status quo, which we're already seeing at the moment in development terms and governance terms, and possibly eventually a decline in donor involvement, but not a change in policy. Now, the people that I interviewed, and this is all conducted Chatham House rules, because nobody will speak to you out there unless you give them that guarantee. So they identified two main things that were blocking discussions of the development of a plan B. First was the foreign policy of their countries, and that they were totally committed to the two-state solution. And secondly was the fact that the Palestinian leadership itself had no plan B, and that they were also wedded to plan A also. Now, many aid officials said that they couldn't actually move beyond what was proposed by the Palestinian leadership. But they also pointed out that they actually themselves put a lot of pressure on the Palestinian leadership not to abandon Oslo and not to embrace an alternative approach, possibly based on civil rights. So this seems like one of these circular processes that are pretty much like the other conundrums that we see emerging in the OPT. There have been some small changes though, and again this has been in order to save the two-state solution. They've expanded their work beyond the Oslo geographical restrictions into working in Area C and East Jerusalem. Now this is a big change in the last few years. When I last looked at this issue in 2010 and 11, there was almost no donors working there. There's also been some changing towards advocacy for resilience and rights. And although these donors are in the minority, some of them spoke about developing an advocacy approach and actually supporting organisations that campaign for housing rights, for civil rights. And these are both Palestinian and Israeli groups involved in this legal and advocacy work. Now this is very new, and the two donors that told me that they were doing this is just a shift in their policy in the last year. It's really unlikely that the major donors will move in that direction, but I think it's interesting that the smaller donors are seeing that there's a gap there that needs to be filled. Now, some of the large European donors said that they'd been given a green light to do more in the realm of strengthening resilience and trauma work, but that they had been told by their capital cities to try and keep it under the radar a little bit. And so there's this constant problem of navigating between what they know needs to be done on the ground and what they're restricted by their ministries of foreign affairs. So in some ways the plan A is being stretched, but there's definitely still no plan B. Now, I spoke about how the principles of donor aid, as represented by the Paris Declaration on aid effectiveness, does not apply to the OPT and indeed cannot apply. And they're all really recognising the strictures that they work within, and the whole real political character of aid to the OPT. They know they can't apply the same principles to the PA as they do to other aid recipients, and so this also structures the debate, particularly around things like corruption and whether you can measure development impacts. Now, all of them expressed the opinion that their programmes are not doing traditional development, nor is it sustainable, but that it's politically necessary for stabilisation based on waiting for a political solution. Now, all of these governments are still committed to staying, and they don't actually envisage a time when they might pull out. However, some of them did say that one of the triggers that might lead to a ditching of the lead to them pulling out would be the quartet principles being ditched, or the end of security coordination by the PA. That this might be the core trigger for them to depart. There's a lot more that I could say about what the donors think about the PA and the state building agenda, but I've run out of time. I just want to basically finish by saying that all of the interviews that I've conducted and I'm continually conducting reveal that the Oslo Framework is incredibly resilient, and it's not really going to change in the near future. There's spaces where it's being stretched a little bit, but unless there's a dramatic change in the political landscape, I don't see the donors changing their perspective. Stabilisation for them remains the name of the game, and I would argue that this is the problem with Oslo in general. Now, I didn't want to finish on that note, and I wanted to finish with the proposal for an alternative, and Ala's given me permission for a couple more minutes. So, although I'm very cynical of this, I think it's a great idea, and it's based on a chapter by Mushtaq Khan, who's a professor of economics at SOAS. He has a chapter in my recent co-edited book, Decolonising Palestinian Political Economy. Now, Khan argues that the OPT is in a state of indefinite transition. So he therefore argues that the donors should use international law and the UN concept of larger freedoms to frame their aid agenda and an alternative development approach. Now, this has three principles. I'll just quickly outline them for you, but I'll direct you to read the chapter in the book. It's very good. So the three principles are freedom from want, freedom from fear, and freedom to live in dignity. Now, Khan argues that freedom from want will require a focus on long-term Palestinian coping strategies, because this isn't going to change overnight. So he proposes some sort of focus on coping strategies. In terms of freedom from fear, he argues that actually what needs to happen is that there needs to be a political process that provides hope for a real open Palestinian debate about credible strategies for liberation. And this means that all parties need to be allowed to be part of that debate. And he argues that in order to ensure freedom to live in dignity, then there needs to be domestic and international mobilisations to try to protect Palestinian political and civil rights while they're in this period. Now, he argues that donors should follow these principles, and as I say, I think it's a very good idea, and I think at least it's proposing something that the donors could discuss and possibly debate. But given my experience of working on these issues for many years, I'm not really holding my breath that this will be the driving force of donor involvement in the OPT. Sorry to end on such a negative note, and I'm hoping that we can move over to
I think it's working. If you try to speak to her.
Thank you very much, Mandy. So many ideas. I hope, Diana, you can hear us.
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Great. Great. So thank you for your patience. And so you have 20 minutes, Diana, to tell us here what's happening with Oslo Accords, where it is, what happened, and provide the overall framework for our mini conference today.
Thank you very much. So first, I want to begin by thanking you for putting up with all of this. It seems like these technical issues are never going to be resolved. But thanks for coming up with alternatives. And I also want to thank everybody people I've been working with the past while. It's been really a pleasure and an honor. I wanted to focus most of my comments today on both on my paper and a little bit beyond my paper in terms of looking at what the lasting impact of the Oslo agreements is, and not just looking at the nitty-gritty, what happened during the negotiations, etc., but more along the lines of how is it that we analyze the framework that Oslo has created and what is part of the lasting legacy. This is particularly important when you look at some of the day-to-day events that are happening in Palestine, particularly now, given the most recent spate of resignations, non-resignations, perhaps resignations that are occurring within the PLO. And what I want to do is really just break down, and what I did do in my paper is really broke down what the Oslo agreements were actually about. And at their core, if you read through the thousands of pages, most of it is actually quite banal and very detail-oriented on some things, and then of course not detail-oriented on many other respects. But the main things that happened were four, and I'm going to go through each of the four. The first was that the Oslo Accord set up for the first time this idea of Palestinian recognition of Israel. And this recognition of Israel appears obviously in one of the very first documents, the letters of mutual recognition, and then continues out through the various agreements, with the central idea being that Palestinians are now to not only recognize Israel, but recognize Israel's right to exist in peace and security. And this becomes very important because it is through these agreements, through this phraseology, that we see different things happening. First and foremost, we see that Israel ends up getting the benefit of legitimacy. In that, a number of different countries end up signing agreements with Israel, trade agreements with Israel, recognizing Israel, everything from warming of relations within the Arab world, trade offices in Oman and in Morocco, and peace agreements with Jordan. All of this comes as the result of the Oslo Accord. And so at their core, the very first element was this idea of recognition. Now, in exchange, there was no recognition of Palestine. And there remains no recognition of Palestine. And this becomes important because, as we see today, in the current day, there still is no recognition on the part of any of the Israeli political leaders that there should be a free and independent Palestine, that the 1967 borders are the borders, but instead it's just simply a recognition of the Palestine Liberation Organization. That's it. And this is one of the first elements of the Oslo Accords. The second element of the Oslo Accords, and of course the legacy of it, is the separation of the people from the land. And I know that some of my colleagues are going to talk more about the separation of the people from the land in the sense of who gets excluded from the Oslo agreements. But this becomes a very, very central issue. First, we have excluded from these Oslo agreements the Palestinians who are citizens of the state of Israel, myself included. And then also excluded from the Oslo agreements become the Palestinian diaspora, and then Palestinian refugees who are put off into some distant fictitious future, and including also Palestinians from East Jerusalem who are also put off into this distant future. But the separation of people from the land doesn't stop there. The only way that the Oslo Accords continue to function to today is through the system of Area A, B, and C that was created under the Oslo agreements, and that continues to operate to this very day. What's interesting about all of this is that back in 2001, Ariel Sharon had renounced the Oslo agreements. He later backtracked after some donor pressure. But for all intents and purposes, the Israeli government operates as though the Oslo agreements don't exist any longer, and yet this separation of the people from the land continues to remain in effect. So everything from the requirement to get permits, the need to the idea that Palestinians are concentrated in areas A and areas B. So 98% of the population concentrated on 40% of the land. And even so far as Palestinian decision making, what Palestinian decision makers have since done is, rather than challenge Area C and work against the separation of the people from the land, they've been doing the opposite of focusing on what's called the state building exercise, is an attempt to try to build up the very tiny areas that were allotted to the Palestinian Authority in some shape or form under the Oslo agreements. The third element of Oslo that is very important is the creation of the Palestinian Security Force. And the bulk of the Oslo agreements really focus on this idea of Palestinians creating a security force that's going to as Thomas Friedman once said to me, sniff out their own. So effective is this Palestinian security force that ends up being established that more of the budget to this current day goes towards security than the Palestinian Authority budget goes towards security than goes to education and health combined. The Palestinian Authority has among one of the highest per capita security forces of around the world. And security, there is no shortage of funding, as I'm sure Mandy had already mentioned in her paper. There's no shortage of funding from the donors coming in to continue to support this security force. That people who are not great friends of Palestine praised it and applauded it, including people Thomas Friedman, as I already mentioned, Martin Indyk, Bill Clinton, Israeli officials as well. And this remains now the central component of Oslo, and the remaining vestige of Oslo. As Mandy mentioned at the tail end of her paper, the tail end that I heard, a lot of the donor fund was tied up into this concept of security coordination. And so this remains this legacy that, in addition to the separation of the people from the land, which affects the economy, there's now a security force in place to be able to guard over those Palestinians living under Palestinian Authority control, with money only coming to the Palestinian Authority should that cooperation continue. And the fourth vestige of the Oslo agreements is the idea that it's negotiations, liberation by negotiations only. And we continue to see this in various shapes and various forms. Whereas in the past there were different ideas of how to liberate Palestine, one of the central tenets remains today that anything is only going to be done through a bilateral process of negotiations, even when it's been proven that this bilateral process of negotiations is a complete sham and a complete failure, as we saw over the various years of negotiations. So entrenched is this idea of negotiations that even today, as you hear of the various state building measures, the state building initiative is simply a mechanism to improve one's hand at negotiations, or the UN bid that the PLO, PA had pushed forward a number of years was only done as a means of building up their hand at negotiations. And other initiatives, whether it's the idea of boycott, divestment, sanctions, or holding Israel accountable, or using lawfare, are all being discounted simply because of this vestige of Oslo and the creation of Oslo. In all of this, what's become very interesting is that it's as difficult as it is to get rid of Oslo, because it has become so entrenched over a period of 22 years, that there are people who are beginning to see and criticize very openly these negotiations, this path, this methodology, and I share Mandy's viewpoint that it's going to be very difficult to get rid of all of these mechanisms because of the fact that so much time has passed and so much money has been invested into this system. But what's interesting is that even as far back as just a month ago, public opinion polls are indicating that 42% of Palestinians are coming forward and saying that they believe that the Palestinian Authority, which at its core is really a security force, should be dissolved. So the thesis throughout my paper is really focused on how we see what's going on today as the legacy of what happened throughout the Oslo period and what Oslo set up and what it created, what it did not create. What it did not create was a mechanism for liberation. What it did create was a system of subservience and of dependency on Israel and on the international donor community. I hope I didn't take too much of time.
No, thank you. That's really great. We're catching up now, so I assume you will leave us now and come back at the Q&A, Diana, or are you staying with us online?
Yeah, I can come back at the Q&A.
Okay, we need another 25 minutes, I think.
Fantastic.
Okay, thank you and sorry that with all the excitement I missed that you're online, I missed introducing you. So we were listening to Diana Bhutto, and she's a lawyer specializing in international law, negotiations, and international human rights. And she was a fellow with Harvard and Stanford, and she's currently as well a policy advisor of Al-Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network. So thank you, Diana, for all your thoughts, and we will come back to you in the Q&A. I'm sure so many will ask you lots of questions. And now we will move to the last paper of this, or two papers, as Mansour would like to keep telling me.
I hope so.
So we have Dr. Mansour Nasasra, and Mansour is a research fellow at the CBRL. And before that, he was a lecturer at the University of Exeter, and now he's resuming a new teaching position in Ben Gurion University. So 25 minutes, 25?
Well, thank you. Well, I planned for more than that, but it would be fine, hopefully. Well, thank you. Thanks for organizing the event, for hosting us, Toby and Ala, for the great introduction. Actually, I was doing a number of research pieces for the whole project, and I looked at the Palestinians in Israel and the exclusion, as Diana mentioned, of the Palestinians in Israel from the peace accord. And I looked at, in particular, the political parties and the dynamics inside Israel amongst the Palestinians in Israel after the peace process. And I also looked at the Jerusalem cause, which was basically excluded from the framework of Oslo, but and I think Jerusalem became one of the key challenges basically for the whole debate on Oslo. Was excluded from Oslo. However, the key focus of the Israeli policies, I would say, was in Jerusalem, and which basically contributed quite a lot to the fragmentation policies of East Jerusalem from the entire cause of the Palestinians. So the first paper hopefully will be on integration and disintegration East Jerusalem since the Oslo Accord. And then I will move to the second piece of research on the Palestinians in Israel and their exclusion from the peace accords. So I'll start with the Jerusalem cause. So what I have been doing is basically examining, in relation to Jerusalem, the impact of the Oslo Agreement on East Jerusalem based on intensive fieldwork and interviews with ordinary Palestinians from East Jerusalem, Palestinians and Israeli officials as well, Arab members of Knesset in Israel, and Palestinian governors as well. Following its occupation and de facto annexation by Israel in 1967, East Jerusalem remains a key challenge to Israeli claims for sovereignty over the whole city. 20 years after Oslo, East Jerusalemites remain marginalized and without influential political leadership. the restrictive fragmentation policies imposed by Israeli separation wall have also angered a lot of people who have become segregated and oppressed in East Jerusalem. Although Oslo guaranteed to protect Palestinian institutions and allow them to function regularly, many have shut down, and contributing further to the physical and economic separation of Jerusalem from the West Bank and Gaza, and to the lack of political representation. So the ongoing struggle regarding sovereignty with Jordan over the Awqaf in particular, and the Old City has also influenced the emergence of another actor to the conflict, which was not intended to be there, which is the Palestinian Arab minority in Israel, and in particular the role of the Islamic movement, the growing role of the Islamic movement in East Jerusalem, in particular in relation to the Awqaf. And also the cause of the East Jerusalem has become a key challenge in the Israeli Knesset and between the Arab parties and the Jewish parties, in particular, different proposals that were basically discussed to impose full sovereignty over Jerusalem by Israel. So Jerusalem, since 1967, after 1967, the Palestinians faced massive expulsions from Jerusalem, and it has been commented by even Israeli media resources since 1967. Throughout the end of 2013, Israel expelled 14,000 Jerusalemites-born Palestinians from the city. The low-key deportation of Palestinians in East Jerusalem throughout legal moves resulted in the renovation of thousands of ID cards as well. Since 1967, with the Palestinian work that had been done by Basia, for example. Despite its full annexation to Israel, the East Jerusalem might suffer from extreme poverty, a lack of job opportunities, and weak physical and economic infrastructure. So I think it has been described that the Jerusalem or the Old City has been destroyed by the occupation. It has been divided and torn and scared in different reports that I have reviewed also from the Israeli point of view, while reports issued by other Israeli organizations like the Association for Civil Rights in Israel confirmed that the deterioration of the Palestinian situation in Jerusalem, which may clearly put out that Israeli policy for the last 4 decades has taken concrete form as discrimination in planning and constructions, expropriation of land, and minimal investment in the physical infrastructure and government and municipal services. The city Palestinians' neighborhoods face an absence of adequate physical infrastructure, a severe shortage of public services, and the lack of funding for contending with the ongoing planning problems. So around 78 live below the poverty 78% live below the poverty line in Jerusalem today, while the cumulative effect of annexation, neglect, rights violation, and the completion of the separation barrier have led to an unprecedented deterioration in the conditions of Palestinians of East Jerusalem. So more recently, Al-Quds newspaper reported that 82% of children in East Jerusalem are facing poverty and hard conditions. Despite that, East Jerusalem constitutes 37% of the entire population of the overall Jerusalem population. They don't get proper services from the municipality of Jerusalem in many levels and sectors. So that's the situation since 1967. While Oslo basically brought the hope to change those facts. However, we haven't seen any later on. So, well, as other Palestinians, the way they viewed Oslo was that this is a very good opportunity to unify with families for East Jerusalemites in Jordan and in the Palestinian territories. The hope that was the Palestinians who have fled from Jerusalem in 1967 would be allowed to come back to the city and reunited with their families. That's amongst the interviews I have conducted in the Old City. As young Palestinians put it, we were hoping that Oslo would reunify us with our relatives in Jordan and other contexts. So the hub of Oslo led to the influx of to the city. A significant number of Palestinians migrated back to the city after Oslo, which was very interesting phenomena. This hub of reunification also encouraged some East Jerusalemites to go back to the city, as well as local Jerusalemites pointed out in different interviews a very interesting dynamic occurred in the city in 1993 after the Oslo Agreement was signed, with the influx, as I said, of Palestinians returning to East Jerusalem, tried to buy houses and secure their positions for future scenarios. So, however, despite that the hope that Oslo brought this hope a few years after we have started to see or to witness the negative impact on Oslo, despite that Jerusalem was not part of the peace agreement. And the first significant issue here is related to fragmenting Jerusalem from its Palestinian space, which is quite significant. The immediate impact of Oslo in Jerusalem was to isolate the city from the rest of the Palestinian territories, and this has been summarized by a number of Palestinian governors, like Hind Khouri, for example, a former Minister for Jerusalem Affairs, pointing out that Oslo is all about fragmenting Palestinian society and weakening its clout and preventing any kind of resistance for independence or sovereignty, or even for constructing itself as a community. Oslo also has strengthened the dividing of Jerusalem from Bethlehem and the West Bank and weakened the social interaction of the Jerusalemite with the rest of the Palestinian people. This particular insight would summarize the whole issue. And on the ground, as Israeli scholars, Minhem Klein and others argued, Oslo on the ground opened the competition between both sides in terms of who creates more facts on the ground to preempt the final status negotiations in relation to East Jerusalem. Another aspect that has been significant in East Jerusalem was since signing the Oslo Agreement was that we have seen more Israeli settlers living in East Jerusalem. Since the Oslo Agreement, the number of Israeli settlers occupying houses in the middle of Arab neighborhoods like Sheikh Jarrah and many others, confirming the early policies of the Israeli leadership, including leading Jerusalem mayors who perceived that in order to tighten their control over the East Jerusalem, they needed to increase the Jewish presence in all parts of the city as fast as possible. According to OCHA statement, Israeli settlements have been constructed in East Jerusalem since its occupation, and nowadays there are around 200,000 settlers in East Jerusalem, which basically confirms what Adnan Husseini, the Palestinian governors of Jerusalem, basically stated, that the silent transfer has intensified since Oslo in Jerusalem. Radical settler groups, as well as taking residence in East Jerusalem, in Arab neighborhoods such as Silwan and Sheikh Jarrah, has contributed to the ongoing conflict between the Palestinians and the settlers in the city, which has been also supported by the Israeli right-wing organizations. So similar takeover of Palestinian houses have also been evident in neighborhoods of Silwan, settlement building in the Arab neighborhoods such as Jabal al-Abu Ghunaim, Ras al-Amoud and Abu Dis was an obvious sign of the Israeli Judaization plans. Since Oslo, it has been massive. And I would emphasize that Oslo was a practical tool for isolating the East Jerusalemite from the rest of the Palestinian communities. In particular, the wall, it has a significant impact on the Palestinian economy and the daily interaction between the West Bank and East Jerusalem and Bethlehem. So the creation of the wall in particular had a huge impact on people's daily life, for example, on the other economic activities and job opportunities, whilst their daily interaction with the old city of Jerusalem became restricted. As a result of the separation wall, including the roadblocks, and tens of thousands of Jerusalemites were cut off from the city and parted from direct contact with their relatives. According to local Palestinians, the wall disconnected a number of neighborhoods in Jerusalem periphery from Jerusalem itself and trapped people holding different ID cards between the borders, which has been significant. So the impact was in particular on families, and the wall has a direct impact on Palestinian families and their relatives who were trapped on the other side of the border or the wall, with the result that the first degree relatives were separated from each other. In addition, there were significant difficulties in getting to jobs and receiving services in the city, which has been significant. And another issue was the economy, which basically historically and since before 1967, Jerusalem was part of the the Jordanian economy. However, since it was occupied in 1967, the East Jerusalemite economy started to function as both part of the Israeli economy and Palestinian economy. So since Oslo, local merchants, Palestinian merchants and businessmen recalled that the few years before Oslo witnessed positive growth on the Palestinian economy in East Jerusalem. Free movement of merchants and Palestinians from Gaza and the West Bank was part of the economic mosaic of the city, and it was considered as a golden era for the East Jerusalemite economy. However, Jerusalem before Oslo was an open city, and Palestinian cars reached the city easily, even from Gaza, and even throughout Jerusalem economy did recover for a few years. After Oslo, the situation has slightly started to change. And on the eve of the first Intifada, and just before Oslo, it was estimated the East Jerusalemite economy contributed 15% of the total GDP of the occupied Palestinian territories, which was 250 million in 1990. Comparing to the West Bank, the East Jerusalemite benefited less economically than the occupied Palestinian territories in the era of post-Oslo. So the creation of the new borders, the walls, the checkpoints, isolated Jerusalem economically from the West Bank and Gaza, and also led to a significant number of local Palestinian businesses moving also to Ramallah, Hebron, and Bethlehem. So that was the economic policies of also resulted in closing down a significant number of Palestinian local businesses in East Jerusalem. And according to different organizations and NGOs reports, more than 5,000 Palestinian businesses have closed their doors since 1999, even a few years after all. As a result of deteriorating situation of East Jerusalem, most Palestinian businessmen began instead to invest, as I mentioned, in Ramallah, Bethlehem, Hebron, and in other areas outside the West Bank. And obviously this has a clear impact on the Palestinian local economy. Lack of industrial zones in East Jerusalem. The majority of the local businessmen either started to invest in Jewish business parks or in other areas like Ramallah, as I mentioned, and Bethlehem. That was one of the key impacts on the Palestinian economy and daily life and interactions between the Palestinians in East Jerusalem and other areas. Now I move to one of the most important impacts of Oslo in East Jerusalem is what I called fabricating Oslo. We were talking about Oslo as a peace agreement, and according to different reports by the Norwegian officials, Oslo granted freedom of basically different Palestinian institutions to function in the city. However, what we have seen after Oslo, that a significant number of Palestinian institutions in East Jerusalem were closing down. This has also limited the PLO access to Jerusalem. So the leadership was not allowed to be developed in East Jerusalem, and this has also led to closing a significant number of Palestinian institutions, including human rights, relief organizations, tourist and economic, media, educational, cultural organizations and services, kindergartens, women's and youth organizations, and political and civil society organizations. So, and some of them were pushed to move, those organizations, local grassroots organizations were pushed to move to other, to the Palestinian territories, which has been significantly an impact on the local dynamics in East Jerusalem. I think the closing down Palestinian institutions in East Jerusalem was a clear message to the Palestinians that you will not have any political presence in the city, including the Orient House, and this has also led to the crisis, what I called, and the vacuum of Palestinian leadership in East Jerusalem. The PLO as a leadership was not allowed to function in East Jerusalem. So closing down Palestinian institutions in East Jerusalem has also contributed, I would say, to the crisis in the leadership, since the Palestinian political leadership, including the Palestinian governor himself of East Jerusalem, must function from outside outside Jerusalem. The Palestinians in East Jerusalem today are leaderless. Nowadays there is no official Palestinian political body that functions in East Jerusalem. There's a double sword exclusion. On the one hand, the East Jerusalemites are not represented at the Israeli political system, and on the other, the PLO is prevented from operating in the old city. As leading East Jerusalemite figures pointed out, since the death of Faisal al-Husseini, the Fatah strongest representative in East Jerusalem, and the PNA Minister of Religious Affairs, Sheikh Hassan Tahboub, chairperson of the Islamic Council. There is no political leadership to speak on behalf of the Palestinian population in East Jerusalem. Adnan Husseini himself, the current governor of East Jerusalem, functions from outside the city, which is from Al-Ram, which basically tells you exactly that even the Palestinian official governor are not based in the city. So I think that has led to a significant number of the weak part of the Palestinian East Jerusalem without political institutions and without also political representations. And this has led to the emergence of the Palestinian in Israel context of starting to play an important role in what has been going in the Old City. It has also challenged the historical role of the Awqaf, which is supported by Jordan in the Old City. So I've seen different organizations that are trying to basically to claim representation in East Jerusalem. The first one is the Awqaf, which is supported by Jordan as one of the strongest institutions, the quasi-state institutions that functions in the Old City. And I think that this has also brought other actors to East Jerusalem, in particular the Islamic movement from inside Israel under the leadership of Sheikh Ra'ad Salah, the northern brand, who started to play an important role in the Old City. And those particular actors started also to compete with the overall debate on the sovereignty over Jerusalem. This debate has also reached the Israeli parliament, and there's a current debate. It has been going for years in the Israeli parliament, which basically mainly between the Arab MPs of Israel as well as the Jewish right-wing under, in particular, Moshe Feiglin, who was proposing a full Israeli sovereignty over the Old City. And I think this debate over sovereignty has taken place in the Israeli Knesset for the last few years. And this also is, who represented the Palestinian of East Jerusalem were mostly the Arab MPs of Israel. And this has brought different actors to cooperate with each other in the Old City, including the representatives of the Islamic movement from Israel, the Awqaf as a significant organization in the Old City, as well as the Islamic movement as a key organization inside Israel. So I think those has brought different aspects of dynamics to the city. What I would conclude for the East Jerusalem cause, before I move to the other part, is that I have seen different policies of integration and disintegration. On one hand, Israel tried to integrate the Palestinian of East Jerusalem into the system by investing and putting more economic weight to the Old City and East Jerusalem population. On the other hand, there has been also resistance, a local resistance movement against the integration policies that led by local organizations and NGOs in the Old City, in particular when it comes to the economic factors. And we have seen this very much clear. Has reported by the Israeli media resources after the war on Gaza. We have seen a significant movement of trying to boycott the Israeli economy and also the interaction with the western part of the city. So I think that's briefly the situation in Jerusalem. The key aspects I have managed to pull together from different directions, but the overall I think impact of Oslo and the lack of discussing the case in the Oslo Accord has basically opened up the competition between Israel and the Palestinians, who will create more facts on the ground for more issues that would be discussed in the final peace agreement. So I think I mentioned the Palestinians in Israel as an actor. Diana mentioned them as excluded from the peace process, and this is basically my second piece. Briefly in 10 minutes, maybe, Ala?
9.
9 minutes. Okay. Well. So what I would like to do in the 9 minutes, Salah, is what I called rereading Oslo, indigenous perspectives, the Palestinians inside Israel. Why they were excluded, and what Oslo has contributed to us, after all, had to contribute to the Palestinians in Israel. I think was very, very interesting dynamics that I think surprised also me as someone who conducted a lot of interviews with the political leadership of the Palestinians in Israel. So what did actors, for example, outside of the main players think about Oslo, the Palestinians in Israel? As an example, did Oslo contribute to the fragmentation of the Palestinian Arab minority in Israel or led to internal unification? How did the Arab minority respond to Oslo? Those are different questions that I raised, and I tried to address while writing this particular piece. So, as argued by a number of Arab minority leaders inside Israel, it is hard to see a final resolution for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict without thinking or taking into consideration the Palestinian Arab minority in Israel, because there is a very significant issue of family relationship and different historical relationship there. However, nor Israel nor the PLO or any other international actors included them in the negotiations, since the focus was always on the Israeli-Palestinian issue. So despite this general assumption that at that time Palestinian minorities should be part of any peace agreement between Israel and the Palestinians, interviewing a significant number of leaders amongst the minority in Israel, including MPs as well as different activists, revealed that the exclusion of the Palestinian minority inside Israel contributed significantly to what I call the localization of the politics of the Palestinian minority in Israel, which started to become a significant component of the Palestinian Israeli life after Oslo. And which I think this has been the most significant part amongst the Palestinian Israel. But before that, Israel perceived, the Israeli official opinion in this, that the Palestinian Israel will never be part of any peace process with the Arab world or with the Palestinians. And we have seen those statements even released by Ariel Sharon himself and the Likud leadership before Oslo. Just before Oslo, Ariel Sharon stated clearly that the Palestinian Israel are excluded from any involvement in the decision regarding the future of the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, and also that the Palestinian citizens of Israel will not be any part of any peace process with the Arab world. They will not have any say on the Palestinian cause as well. I think that's the Israeli official approach. This is an internal issue. This is an internal citizenship issue. We're not going to open this for debate. However, I think on the other side, the Palestinian or the PLO had a historical relationship with the Palestinians in Israel, and I think according to many of the interviews, the significant critical opinions of the Palestinians in Israel toward the PLO, and why. I will explain that. Despite the long historical relationship between the PLO and Palestinian Israel, Oslo questions and challenged this relationship, excluding the Palestinian Israel from the peace negotiations and ignoring their support for the Palestinian cause was a double and historical exclusion. Oslo declared that the Palestinians of Israel are not part of any future peace deal. The PLO led to anger and frustration amongst the Palestinians in Israel, but also, as I mentioned, speeded up the process for the minority to lead their own cause. And I've seen different opinions of the Arab Palestinian minority in Israel, views from the 1990s. For example, Mohammed Zidane, one of the leading activist politicians amongst the Palestinians in Israel during the 1990s, criticized the exclusion from Oslo by saying, "We struggled for years for the Palestinian cause, and today our role hasn't been taken by the PLO as significant." Arab MPs from different parties said clearly the perception of the minority was that the PLO is moving toward a peace solution with Israel. So the question that was raised, that what will happen with us as a minority, as Palestinian minority in Israel, and different MPs argued that the immediate move of the Palestinian Israel was that the more of them joined the Labour Party at that time and supported Rabin as the peacemaker. However, this has changed quickly after the peace agreement, while other voices from the minority pointed out that in Oslo, basically Israel expelled us from the Palestinian cause. This has happened in coordination with the PLO. Also, was the moment that we were expelled from the Palestinian cause. This was, I think, all over the interviews I conducted throughout different political parties. So I think Oslo was criticized by different actors amongst the Palestinian and Israel, in particular the Islamic movement. The Islamic movement was one of the most critical political parties, if you want, and civil society organizations that criticized Oslo because it didn't discuss the issue of internally displaced Palestinians in Israel. It didn't discuss the family relationship between Israel, Palestinians in Israel and the West Bank and Gaza. And also it has a significant impact on family reunification that was not discussed. And I think if we ask any of the Islamic movement leaders, basically the statement was clear that we were marginalized. Our cause was not addressed as part of the Oslo Accord. On the other hand, the PLO had a different and ambiguous relationship toward the Palestinians in Israel and toward their role in Oslo. And I think this contradiction was clear in different interviews. Sometimes the PLO encouraged the Palestinians in Israel to play a significant part in the Israeli politics and in the Knesset. And on the other, sometimes we have seen, without declaring this, the PLO used to send delegations to participate in the Arab parties inside Israel political conferences, and also I think they appointed a Palestinian official that has a relationship with the Palestinian minority in Israel. And today we always see Palestinian delegations that come as a solidarity movement to support the Palestinian cause. We have seen this in different meetings and different conferences, that always there have been a representative from the PLO who also had this relationship with the Palestinian in Israel. And I think one of the conclusions of this particular exclusion by Israel and the Palestinian, that the Palestinian minority in Israel found themselves very interesting in one case, which basically celebrating the peace. That's the position that they were put in. And the Palestinian leadership after Oslo came and visited the Arab minority, the villages, and organized different conferences in the Galilee, in the Little Triangle, and also in the Nakab in the south, about basically celebrating the peace. And on the other hand, sending delegations or Palestinian delegations from Israel to Ramallah and Gaza was an act of supporting the PLO leadership. So that's the overall kind of weight on how the Palestinian Israel were perceived. So you're part of celebrating the peace, but you're not part of the peace process. And this basically was the same approach with Yitzhak Rabin himself when he visited the Arab towns in Israel, and different conferences were organized amongst Palestinians in Israel for signing the peace process. And I think that was one of the most important issues in relating to this marginalized role. So the whole dynamics I explained, I think, led after all to a reaction of the Palestinian minority on Oslo as an agreement. So the impact, basically, and this is one of my key findings, the impact of the Oslo on the Palestinian Israeli citizens is basically the localization of the Palestinian minority politics, and struggle, which basically means that since Oslo, we have seen a significant shift amongst the Palestinians and Israel in terms of splitting from the Zionist parties and creating their own parties. A significant number of the Arab parties in Israel started to emerge immediately after Oslo. And if in the interviews it came quite clear, one or two different organizations or political parties said clearly that we were created as a reactionary movement to Oslo, because we were excluded. Now we have to deal with our own cause. So a significant number of establishment of new parties has been witnessed since Oslo in amongst the Palestinians in Israel. And you might be surprised also that Oslo led to a significant development also further in the south, in the Nakab, which I think the rise of the Bedouin politics started immediately after Oslo, which has been a significant issue. The fact that many Palestinian delegations moved to visit the Nakab and to participate in different political conferences basically led to the final issue of the Nakab case, where basically came strong, the marginalized, the unrecognized villages, So the national awarenesses to the Palestinian context in the Nakba started to become strong and key after the Oslo peace agreements, and this has been said clearly by a number of Eastern Europe educated Bedouins who started to develop their political parties after Oslo, and this has a very strong relationship with the Oslo itself. I think one of the local interesting dynamics that happened amongst the Palestinians in Israel, not only the localization of the politics, it was also the indigenization, what I called, of the voting habits. A significant number of Arab parties were established, and this has also challenged the traditional role of the Labour Party amongst the Palestinians of Israel. More votes started to go to the Arab parties. And I'll give you some examples. Just in 1966, following Oslo, 62% of the Arab votes went to the Arab parties. This increased to 78% in 1999, to 80% in 2003. This shift started in 1996 after the foundation of a number of new Arab parties and the rise of the debate regarding the need for a unified list, which came to reality only in March 2015. According to different local academics, in recent years, the percentage of Arab voting for Zionist parties has dropped dramatically, and this has started to happen clearly after Oslo. Similarly, we can see that the case of the current unified list amongst the Palestinians of Israel, I think this process started since Oslo, and we only have seen the unified list as a successful case of unifying the entire Arab political system inside Israel just in March 2015. So this would lead us to
conclude in 1 minute.
Conclude in 30 seconds. Where are the Palestinians from the one state and two state solutions? And Shireen will speak about alternatives and one state and the debate around this. I think if we look back at the history of the Palestinian and Israel, from 1958, the first Arab party to be established, the effort of the Al-Ard movement, the land movement in 1958, it was clearly followed up with the UN resolution partition plan for Palestine. 1969, Abna al-Balad stated clearly also that they would support a two-state solution. And this particular group, I think the most nationalistic group, as argued by a number of the leaders I interviewed, the party was one of the most nationalistic, and also linked the Palestinian cause or the Palestinian minority cause to the Palestinian cause overall. I think that was the example. However, other Arab parties like the Arab Democratic Party, the Progressive List for Peace, as well as the Democratic Front for Peace and Equality, Hadash, and today's politics, also stated clearly the stance of two-state solution and the right of refugees. But I think they stressed mostly the unification aspects internally, the family unifications from the Palestinian families in Israel and the West Bank and Gaza. I think a similar view was mentioned just recently by the unified list for 2015. The Israeli Palestinian political parties Balad, Hadash, and the United Arab List and the Islamic Movement all agreed to join for elections in January 2015. And also they say clearly in terms of their ideologies that a two-state solution must be implemented as the final solution. And I think this has been a significant move. Their joint platform calls for a just peace based on UN resolutions, ending the occupation of all the land Israeli captured in 1967, dismantling all settlements and the security barrier, releasing all political prisoners, and forming a Palestinian state with Jerusalem as its capital. That's the official view of the United Arab List that we have seen just recently. I think this example would give us the long process that started from Oslo until now, which led to one vote for the Arab parties inside Israel. Thank you.